All right, guys, in this first video, we're going to look at patterns of evolution. Okay, so we're going to talk about everything from extinction all the way down to coevolution. And then in part two of this video, we're going to look at speciation, okay, and some of the mechanisms how or by which species can change and how that occurs, all right? So some questions we want to be able to answer. Number one, what is a mass extinction? We want to know the difference in gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. We want to know adaptive radiation and convergent evolution. We want to know the differences in the two. We want to know the similarities in the two. We want to be able to recognize coevolution. And this is a pretty common thing, so you'll probably want to understand it enough to give an example that I'm not going to go over in this video. So look outside of the video for another one. And then in the second video, you're going to look at speciation and how it usually occurs. So let's talk about extinction events. When we say the word extinction, we mean that the species no longer has any living members. Now, that seems kind of obvious, but remember, it's kind of hard to find all of the species, right? Or all of the members of the species, and make sure that they're all dead. So sometimes we think something's extinct, and then later we have to take it off the extinct list. A good example of that is the coelacanth, big fish that we thought was extinct, and then somebody happened to catch one, right? So that can happen. But generally speaking, extinction means the species is just no longer, it no longer has any living members. Now, something interesting to think about, the vast majority of species that have lived on our planet from the beginning of life to now, 99% of them are extinct already. And they can go extinct for a lot of reasons, all right? So mass extinctions are kind of a different branch of this. So if something goes extinct, like a single animal, there could be a lot of reasons for that. The dodo bird is an example, right? They hunted the dodo bird to extinction. Well, it was just one species. Not that that's, a good thing, but it's just one species, one extinction event. A mass extinction event is an event where many, many, many species all go extinct about the same time. And this is going to change kind of the biodiversity and the biosphere. It's going to change the landscape with which the remaining living organisms kind of have to figure out how to deal with the ecosystem moving forward. So we're going to look at those. So let's first look at some mass extinctions. There have been 5 major mass extinction events. There is some argument that we are currently in the middle of a 6th, but we'll leave that for another day. And typically, you'll see that the extinction events kind of classify a transition from one time period to another one. So we have the Ordovicium Silurian mass extinction, or the Devonian Carboniferous mass extinction. So we can see that they are, right there on the border between 2 different eras. One that you're probably familiar with that we're going to talk the most about today is the Kt Extinction. So I am going to briefly give you an overview of the other 4. You don't need to memorize these. You don't need to know the years, but it's interesting just to kind of look at what we know about these mass extinction events. So the Ordovicium Silurian is the 2nd largest extinction event that we have on record. It was hypothesized to be caused by cooling climate and glaciation. We lost about 85% of the marine species in the fossil record at the time. The Devonian Extinction, all right, actually led to a lot of the oil that we use today, are mostly affected marine species. The extinction event between the Permian and the Triassic era, which was 250 million years ago, is the largest mass extinction event that we have. There are a lot of different hypotheses for how that could have occurred. Most of them involve climate change and like what we call widespread volcanism. So volcanoes were erupting all over the place. Volcanoes release greenhouse gases. It leads to a change in climate. And this led to a pretty drastic reduction in marine species. About 96% of the marine species in the fossil record are thought to have died out at that time. And of the land-going species, about 70%. Now, there was another one at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, again, thought to be caused by greenhouse effect, perhaps from volcanoes. There were a tremendous number of vertebrates and plants that were lost, but this actually led to the rise of the dinosaurs. We also have the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction. This is often called the Kt extinction. It's the one you're probably the most familiar with. It happened 65 million years ago, and it led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. It was caused by an asteroid impact. That's the leading hypothesis. About 75% of the species that were currently in it, or at the time currently in existence, were lost. But here's the thing about extinction, and this is the big takeaway. Every time there's an extinction event, a lot of niches go vacant. And so if there are vacant niches in the ecosystem, then there's less competition, which allows other organisms to fill in those spots. All right. So let's look at the Kt extinction, because this is a pretty interesting set of evidence. It is the most recent mass extinction event we have. This is where they think the asteroid impacted Earth. This is the Chicxulub crater in the Yucatan down in Mexico. Now, obviously, in 65 million years, the crater itself has been slightly reshaped by, filling in of sediments and the movement of, waves and all this stuff, because it is right where the ocean meets the land here. But using what's called a gravity map, the scientists have checked to see, or kind of built a model that shows you the topological features. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word there. Now, when you see the blue regions, all right, green and blue is a gravity low, all right, and the red and yellow are gravity highs, and the white dots all around the edge here, these are sinkholes, all right, which are called cenotes, which typically follow the edge of an impact crater. Now, you might look at that picture and go, that's kind of odd, right? It's got these highs and these lows. Well, if you pick it up and you look at high, low, so it has low in the middle, right here. Let's see if we can draw this thing. So we're going to come straight up from the middle. So we have a low. And then right here around the ring, right, there's a high. Kind of like that. And then we have another low, right there. So another low, followed by another high. Not quite as high, right? There's not quite as much red. And so a cross section of the land would kind of look like that, which is pretty similar to this piece or this picture of water, or a water droplet being dropped into this puddle of water. Because if you take an asteroid that's 6 miles across and you run it into the Earth, there's going to be an extremely high temperature that is associated with that. It's going to melt the rocks of the crust. And when they melt, they're a fluid. They're going to behave like a fluid. And so we expect to see these fluid waves kind of emanating from that crater. So when you look at the Kt area now, it doesn't really look like, oh, there's a big crater there. But when you start to examine those gravity highs and lows, and you look at that ring system, you can see what happened there? Let's go back. Oh, that thought. There we go. We can see these high regions, low regions, high region, low region, high, low, high, so on and so forth. All right. So that's the evidence that's one piece of evidence they have for the impact crater of the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs. The second one is what we call the Kt boundary. So if a 6 mile wide asteroid impacted the Earth, we would expect there to be some dirt and some dust and some what we call ejecta blown up into the atmosphere that would be scattered around. When asteroids hit, they can instantly cause the melting of that surface crust, and that gets shot up into the air as a molten spray. It pretty much instantly freezes, and it can lead to what we call sphericals, which are these little tiny glass spheres, and shocked quartz, which is when quartz gets hit and it's not quite hot enough to melt it, but it leaves a very distinct geologic trace. And so if there was an asteroid that impacted the Earth, we would expect to find glass sphere, or those glass sphericals and the shock quartz scattered around the impact site. If it was big enough to cause a mass extinction all the way around the globe, it would make sense that we would find evidence of that all the way around the globe. Another thing that meteors and asteroids have a pretty high concentration of is iridium, at least compared to the crust of the Earth. Iridium is rare to non-existent in the crust of the Earth. And so if you find iridium in a geologic sample, chances are that iridium came from an asteroid impact. Well, when we look around the world, we check for what's called the Kt boundary. We found 101 different sites around the planet that all have all of those things. So they have glass sphericals, they have the shock quartz, and they have a layer of iridium, which is laying on top of a layer of clay. And so when you look at the fact that we have this image, right, of an asteroid impact or an asteroid crater, and we also have our Kt boundary, it stands to reason, since they're both the same age, that they came from a common cause. If a 6-mile wide asteroid was to hit the planet today, we would also probably experience a mass extinction event. All right, it would throw dust and debris up into the atmosphere. This could lead to global cooling, and organisms like the dinosaurs, right, which were large animals that needed to eat a lot. When the sun is blocked out and plants start to die, the herbivores start to die, then the meat eaters start to die, and you have a problem with your food pyramid, right? So think about the food pyramid. You have your producers at the bottom, your consumers, and then your predators up here, right? So we have our consumers, we have our producers, we have our predators, we have our consumers in the middle. Well, think about what's at the very bottom of the food pyramid, right? The sun. So if there's a large amount of dust and debris in the atmosphere that blocks the sunlight, it's going to impact the producers, and then everything else up the food chain struggles to survive. Now, switching gears a little bit, why do we care about these extinction events? What do they have to do with the process of evolution, right? Because evolution is genetic change in living things over time. Well, how does that impact, or how does a discussion of extinction events impact our discussion of evolution? Well, there's two ways that natural selection can drive change. It can be fast or it can be slow. Both work. Fast evolutionary change is usually in response to some kind of cataclysm. So an asteroid striking the planet is definitely a cataclysm. Environmental stress, which is kind of defined as quick changes to the environment that don't allow organisms enough time to adapt. This can lead to what we call a bottleneck. So fast changes lead to bottlenecks in our species. If it's a slow change, well, that's going to come from the mutations in the genes that each generation has. Over time, they add up, and the species changes little by little. Both of these methods are, recognized ways as how species can change over time. And you can picture a bottleneck kind of like this picture of traffic. So here on the left, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 lanes of traffic on the left. But on the right, we've got, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4. So as we go from 10 lanes down to 4 lanes, all of these cars, they get stopped up, they get bottlenecked. So this is kind of analogous to a rapid reduction in the availability of resources. So if there's some kind of rapid change to the environment, maybe runaway greenhouse gas or an asteroid impact or global cooling and glaciation that happens in a hurry, resources start to run out. And just like the cars can't all stay in their lanes, all right, they have to adapt or they die out, right? Organisms have to adapt. So some of the lanes don't survive, just like some of the species don't survive. This can lead to an extinction event. It can also cause an organism that was formerly diverse to only have a few members of the species get through, all right, which changes the amount of genetic material available to pass on. We'll look at that a little bit later. Now, slow change can, if we want to stick to our traffic and our cars, you can kind of look at Ford for a great example of slow change. So here's the Model A, 1931, beautiful car, well restored in this picture. And here's a 1967 Shelby GT500, also a beautiful car. If I had to pick between the two, I think I would take the Model A, but it'd be better just to have both, right? Anyway, you can definitely see some slow change here. Now, are there things that haven't changed? Yeah, like the wheels, right? It still has 4 wheels. Now, has the structure of the wheel changed? Absolutely. In the Model A, they're pretty thin, all right? In the GT500, they're pretty wide. It still has doors, right? The doors have changed a little bit. The profile has changed, but they still have a handle because you still got to get in. How about headlights? Well, 1, 2, yep, right there. 1, 2. Still have headlights. The structure has changed, but the function stays the same. So this is a great example of the slow change in organisms over time. You might look and say, all right, well, what would be an example of this? Well, remember back to the homologous structures we find in mammals. We have 1 upper arm bone, 2 lower arm bones, wrist bones, hand bones, and finger bones. Now, they all serve the same function, right? I can move my arm back and forth. I can rotate that single bone up and down. I can rotate my 2 bones here in a slightly different way. I can move my fingers. I can move my hand. Well, if I'm a lion compared to a whale, still mammals, still the same underlying structure, but different functions. So they are slightly different in their shape, right, in their arrangement. Now, when we look at the speed and the path of evolution, we have 2 different ways to explain fast and slow change. We have punctuated equilibrium, which is when there's a long period of stability and then a brief period of major change. So that's the fast one. That is the bottleneck, all right, the 10 lanes of traffic down to 4. There's also gradualism, which is slow, gradual change, right? The answer there's in the name, to the genetic makeup of a species over time. Now, that's the slow one. That's the Model A down to the GT500, right? When you look at a map, all right, a phyletic map or a cladogram, when you see smooth lines like this one over here, so we have smooth lines, that's looking at gradualism. There's some drift, right? We're slowly changing and we're coming to new or speciation events. So anywhere that you see a branch, that is a speciation event where you have 2 new species diverging from one another. If you see straight lines, this is periods of rapid change, right? Rapid change. And so punctuated equilibrium is how we generally explain the rapid change in organisms. So when we look at the fossil record, we find that some species have gradualism as like perfectly mapped out, like the whale. We see, transition species, and it's slow change, and it's really driven by just normal natural selection, genetic mutation, all that stuff. Sometimes we look in the fossil record, we find a species that has a very rapid change. And usually we chalk rapid change up to extreme selection, so a cataclysm, a bottleneck event, something like that. Since we see both, there's not one or the other. It's both mechanisms acting on living things. So if we experience a cataclysmic event, we will be forced as a species to undergo some punctuated equilibrium, some rapid adaptation. Otherwise, we'll die out. If, on the other hand, we have a long period of environmental stability, then the only changes that are going to be occurring are going to follow normal natural selection. So maybe predation or the ability to locate resources, that kind of stuff. So what can we do as far as an example of that? Well, let's look at how the tiger got its stripes. Is it gradualism or is it punctuated equilibrium? So let's look at the gradualism side. So some tigers had stripes, some did not. We had a cat species, some with, striped bodies, some that didn't. Over many generations, the ones with stripes were able to catch more prey. They were able to catch prey more often. It was easier for them. So they were more successful. Since a higher percentage of striped tigers are being successful, they have a better chance of passing on their genes, and slowly but surely, all of the tigers ended up with stripes. That would be gradualism. Punctuated equilibrium says, okay, same scenario. There are tiger species, some have stripes, some don't. There was some kind of cataclysm. A rapid reduction in prey made it a lot harder to find food. So maybe there was, a decades-long drought. Tigers that were better adapted to hide were able to catch food. The stripes helped them hide in the tall grass, and so they were able to pass their genes where the other tigers were not. So this would be an example of punctuated equilibrium. Is one right? Well, no, both are plausible explanations. So either one works as an explanation, right? You have to follow or you have to find some piece of evidence that would support one or the other if you want to explain how the tiger got its stripes. But until you find that keystone piece of evidence, like evidence for a 50-year drought or something that led to the rapid reduction of the tiger's food, then you just look at both and you say both of these are plausible. Typically speaking, just let me jump back here real quick. Typically speaking, a species that have short evolutionary histories we usually classify under punctuated equilibrium. With longer evolutionary histories, they typically display gradualism. All right. So let's look at some other mechanisms of evolution. So we have adaptive radiation, and this is the diversification of a small group of organisms to fill different niches. A niche is a job within an ecosystem. So this is something that can happen after an extinction event when there are a lot of niches open and available. If you work backwards to figure out the common ancestor of an adaptive radiation population, we call that the study of divergent evolution. So they've diverged from one common ancestor. So a great example of that are these little finches, these little birds. So number one there is our common ancestor. And from that common ancestor, we have all these different birds that fill a different niche in the environment. So some of them, like these 18, 19, and 20 here, they eat insects. There are the generalists who eat, quite a few different things. There are nectivores, which are birds that all go after nectar. See a great example of a bird that's beak is perfectly adapted to fit into the flower structure of the plant that it feeds on. We have the frugivores and the seed eaters, which also have highly specialized beaks. All right, we can see those based on what they eat. And we have the bark pickers, the insectivores, the ones that eat insects, and they have those hook-like beaks or the little sharp needle beaks for picking insects out of the bark. All of these finches, though, are genetically related. And so when we study them and we look for their common ancestor, we call that the study of divergent evolution, because all of these species have diverged from this common ancestor. All right, and so that's what we're studying there. Now, don't get divergent and convergent evolution mixed up. Convergent evolution is when different unrelated species evolve similar adaptations. And a great example of that is the thorn. So why do plants have thorns? Is it because they're all closely related? Well, not actually, that's not necessarily true. So a thorn is a really effective way to keep a herbivore from eating you, right? If you try to bite down on that thorn, it's probably going to stab you in the tongue. That doesn't sound really pleasant, so animals learn to avoid the thorns. It makes sense that successful plants that are low to the ground and not poisonous, that are easy for herbivores to access, might evolve thorns as a coping mechanism, right? To slow down how fast they're eaten. Because if they all get eaten too soon, they can't pass on their genes, right? Well, the rose bush has a thorn. The acacia tree has a thorn. Very similar structures, but they don't share a very recent common ancestor. And so this is an example of convergent evolution, not adaptive radiation or divergent revolution. So let's compare the two just to make sure we get them right. In convergent evolution, you have no recent common ancestor, so the thorn and the acacia tree there, the rose and the acacia tree. The common traits have evolved because they're useful in a common environment, not because they've been passed on through the genes. The codons for those structures, right? Because remember, everything that's on a living organism has to be coded for in the genes. The codons are found on different genes, usually, okay? In divergent evolution, there is a common ancestor present. The traits come from common pathways, from ancestor to offspring, in response to common conditions and the fact that they are related. And the codons are typically found on the same gene. So these would be like our finches that all have similar beaks. Now, coevolution is evolution of different species that are connected based on how they interact in the ecosystem, how their niche works. So flowers and pollinators are great examples of coevolution. So let's talk about bees for a minute. All right, flowers and bees, they go together like hands and gloves, right? So how does that work? How does that evolutionary relationship evolve? Well, one of the things that we know about bees is the view that a bee has of the universe, their vision, is on a different wavelength of our own. They can actually see up here in the UV region of the visible or of the electromagnetic spectrum. We can't see those UV colors, but they can. So when a human looks at a flower, this is what we see. But when a bee looks at a flower, they see something a little different. They see a different color there in the middle. It's kind of like, pulling them in, telling them where to land. So a lot of different flowers that are pollinated by bees and other insects have these UV markers. And, when we look at a flower, again, we're not seeing this, but when you look at it under a UV light with a UV filter, you can see, hey, this is like telling the bee, look, check out right here. Great big, neon sign. This is another really good one. Here's what we see. We see this. Here's what the bee sees. All right. The bee is like, hey, it's there. That's where I need to go. So that is a great example of coevolution, where the pollinators that, evolve these color structures, right? These pigmentation patterns were able to be, seen by the bees, were more likely to be pollinated, and thus they were able to pass their genes along. Here's another really famous example of coevolution. This is called Darwin's orchid. It's found on Madagascar. And the nectar for this plant is all the way down here in this spur. So it's way down here. So in order to get to the nectar, you have to go in right here, and you have to be able to reach all the way down in that spur to get the nectar. The spurs are like 10 to 17 inches long. That is a long way to go for a bee. A bee can't get to that, right? So the question was, what animal could possibly access that nectar? Because if this species is successful, it must have evolved a way for its pollen to be spread around. Needs a pollinator. Well, they found the pollinator. It's called Darwin's moth. It has a tongue that can reach all the way back to that 17-inch spur. So it's a big moth. What's the benefit for the moth? Well, there's no competition for food. Like, nobody else can get to that nectar, and so Darwin's moth has a steady supply of food. Well, what's the, benefit for the orchid? Well, since Darwin's moth only feeds on Darwin's orchids, the pollen that it picks up automatically gets spread around to other orchids. It doesn't get wasted on another plant. One of the things about bees go to a lot of different plants, so there's no guarantee that your pollen directly goes to the right plant. In Darwin's moth's case, when it, lands on the orchid and its little fuzzy face gets covered in that pollen while it's drinking the nectar, when it goes to the next plant, well, it's guaranteed to go to one of those other orchids. So that's a good thing for the orchid. All right, so that's the end of the first video. Take a break. If you have any questions, let me know, but we'll pick this up in the second video and we'll look at speciation.